2013, slap bang in the middle of the South China Sea, satellite imagery started picking up something weird out in the open ocean, where there was absolutely nothing before. Something was growing. At first, it was just a tiny speck. A few months go by. It starts looking like an island. A few more months. Suddenly there's an airstrip. Hangars, radar stations popping up. Islands were literally growing out of the ocean, and China was building them. They were dumping millions of tons of sand onto coral reefs, pouring concrete, and slapping military bases right on top. And not just in one spot. This was happening all over the South China Sea simultaneously. The Spratly Islands, the Parasol Islands, Scarborough Shoal. On top of these rocks you've probably never even heard of. China was literally manufacturing islands. The Philippines protested. Vietnam protested. Malaysia protested. An international tribunal literally ruled that China's territorial claims completely violated international law. China, they treated that ruling like a piece of toilet paper. So, why go this far? Why ignore international law? Brush off neighboring countries and completely blow off warnings from the US, just to build fake islands in the middle of the ocean. Let's open up the map. There's a really common misconception people have when they first look at a map of China. They think, oh, well, China has ocean access. The Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, the South China Sea. I mean, their entire eastern and southern borders are wide open to the water, right? But whether they can actually use that ocean, that is an entirely different story. Trace your eyes down China's eastern coastline, starting from the top. You've got South Korea, then Japan, Hokkaido, Taiwan, the Philippines. Keep going south, and you hit Malaysia and Indonesia. These countries are lined up perfectly, acting like a massive wall blocking China from the open Pacific. Military strategists call this the first island chain. I mentioned it briefly in part 1, but today we're really going to dig into it. What is an island chain? It's exactly what it sounds like. A defensive line made of islands linked together like a chain. From China's perspective, this chain is a barricade physically locking them out of the Pacific. From America's perspective, it's a fence designed to keep China penned in. And in reality, China simply cannot freely navigate the waters inside this chain. Or want to pass through the strait south of Japan, you have to worry about the Japanese Navy. Want to go through the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan is right there, with the US Navy backing them up. Try to use the Philippine Sea. You have to tiptoe around the Philippines. For the Chinese Navy to reach the open Pacific, they either have to punch a hole straight through this chain, or take a massive detour. They are the second largest economy on the planet. They have the second highest military budget in the world, and yet, the second they hit the ocean, they are boxed in. This is China's ultimate geopolitical inferiority complex. To understand just how deep this complex runs, we have to look at history. Mid-1800s. China genuinely believed it was the greatest power on earth. Their middle kingdom, the literal center of the universe. The emperor was the ruler of all under heaven. But then, 1842, British warships show up on the Chinese coast. The Opium War. The Chinese military just crumbled. Britain completely humiliated them and took Hong Kong. 1894, they lose to Japan. The Sino-Japanese War. They got completely obliterated at sea. Japan took Taiwan. 1900, an alliance of 8 foreign nations marches right into Beijing. They literally occupied the Forbidden City. Do you know where all of this humiliation came from? It all came from the sea. Foreign powers rode in on the ocean. Because China didn't control its waters, the ocean became its deadliest weak point. The Chinese call this era the Century of Humiliation, from 1840 to up until the Communist Party took over in 1949. The trauma of those 100 years is literally branded into China's collective subconscious. If we lose the sea, we are humiliated. We must dominate the ocean. This isn't some idea Xi Jinping just cooked up one day. This is an absolute obsession born from a century of trauma. So when China builds these artificial islands in the South China Sea, is it just a greedy land grab? No, there's a much deeper logic at play here. Find the South China Sea on the map. When you realize just how critical this body of water is, it'll blow your mind. Roughly 1/3 of all global maritime trade passes through here. Hundreds of massive cargo ships every single day. The sea route bringing Middle Eastern oil to South Korea, Japan, and China. It goes right through here. Over 80% of China's imported energy travels through this exact sea. If the US, or any other power, decides to blockade this route, China's energy supply gets instantly cut off. The factory is shut down. The entire economy goes into cardiac arrest. For China, the South China Sea isn't just a body of water. It is their oxygen too. Whoever holds it literally holds the power of life and death over China. So these artificial islands aren't about expanding territory. They are forward defense bases built to protect that oxygen too. At least, that's the logic in Beijing. Now, let's look at why the US is reacting so intensely to this. Since World War II, the US has held undisputed hegemony over the global oceans. The Pacific, especially, has essentially been American lake. The fact that the US Navy can sail freely anywhere they want. That is the absolute bedrock of American power, because controlling the trade routes means controlling the global economy. But if China builds artificial islands and military bases all over the South China Sea, America's freedom to navigate those waters is directly threatened. That is exactly why the US Navy regularly conducts freedom of navigation operations right there. They purposely sail their warships right through the waters China claims to own. It's their way of physically proving, hey, this is not your lake. China calls it a massive provocation. The US calls it a fundamental right. You have the two most powerful militaries in the world playing the high-stakes game of chicken in a very crowded sea, and the fact that there are untold reserves of oil and natural gas buried under that water, that just throws gasoline on the fire. And here, we have to bring Taiwan back into the conversation. We talked about Taiwan in part regarding semiconductors, but Taiwan is about way more than just microchips. Look at Taiwan's location on the map again. Taiwan is sitting dead center in the first island chain, right at the absolute bottleneck between China and the open Pacific. What happens if China takes Taiwan? They punch a massive hole right through the first island chain. The Chinese Navy would be able to pour out into the Pacific completely unchecked. America's primary Pacific defense line would completely collapse. So Taiwan isn't just crucial because of semiconductors. It is crucial because of geography, because of its location. The reason America can never give up Taiwan, and the reason China can never give up Taiwan. They are both looking at the exact same map. They're just reading it from completely opposite directions. Same map, different terrors. That is the true essence of the tension in the Taiwan Strait. And we cannot talk about this without bringing up one more thing, the Belt and Road Initiative. Announced by Xi Jinping in 2013, it's China's massive global infrastructure project, building roads, railways, and ports connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe, all funded by Chinese money. A lot of people view this as a purely economic project. And sure, it is an economic project, but if you trace the route of the Belt and Road on a map, you start to see something else. Whydah Port in Pakistan, Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, ports in Myanmar, now a naval base in Djibouti. Try connecting these dots on the map. It forms a perfect semicircle wrapping right around the Indian Ocean. India calls this the string of pearls strategy. They believe China is trying to militarily encircle them. But look at it from another angle. This isn't an encirclement. Right along the exact maritime route where Middle Eastern energy flows into China, Beijing is quietly building a chain of safe houses to protect its oxygen tube. Take the Strait of Malacca. It's a narrow stretch of water right between Indonesia and Malaysia. 80% of China's energy imports pass through this single choke point. At its narrowest, this strait is only 7 kilometers wide. If the US ever decided to block it, they easily could, and China's energy supply goes dark. China literally calls this the Malacca Dilemma. Their own military strategists named it that. And to solve that dilemma, China is desperately building footholds all across the Indian Ocean. The Belt and Road isn't just an economic project, it is a massive geographical escape hatch. Minus, let me drop a really fascinating piece of history on you here. 600 years ago, the year 1405, an admiral named Zheng He from China's Ming dynasty took a massive fleet out into the ocean. By the standards of time, it was the greatest armada in human history, over 300 ships carrying 27,000 men. This fleet sails to Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, all the way to the east coast of Africa. This was 87 years before Columbus discovered America. China was already navigating the globe. But do you know what happened after Zheng He died? The Ming Emperor banned oceanic voyages. They literally dismantled the fleet. They made it a crime to even build a large ship. Why? Because the ruling elite at the time, the Confucian bureaucrats, viewed expanding into the sea as a greedy, vulgar pursuit. They thought agriculture was the only pure endeavor. The ocean was just an unnecessary distraction. Do you realize what that one decision caused? While China turned its back on the ocean, Europe conquered it. Portugal, Spain, Britain, the Netherlands. They seized the global trade route. They built empires on top of them, and 300 years later, riding the military might of those colonial empires, Europe showed up on China's coastline with warships. The decision to abandon the sea 600 years ago is exactly what caused the Century of Humiliation. Believe me, Xi Jinping knows this history. Minus now, let's get into the most uncomfortable part of today's story. Let's circle back to the artificial islands, the ones China built in the South China Sea. The international courts say it's illegal. Neighbors protest. America warns them. But China didn't stop. And honestly, they are never going to stop. Because for them, this isn't a legal issue. It is an issue of sheer terror. The 100-year memory that losing the sea equals humiliation. The geographical reality that if Malacca is blocked, they suffocate. The strategic claustrophobia of being trapped inside the first island chain. These terrors are driving their actions way harder than any international law ever could. Just like Russia has been obsessively pushing toward one sea for 200 years. China is trying to purge 600 years of regret by forcing its way into the Pacific. Fear dictates policy, and the roots of that fear don't lie in the people. They lie in the map. Minus, let's wrap this up. Those artificial islands float in dead center in the South China Sea. From a satellite, they just look like tiny little dots. But the story buried under every single one of those dots is massive. The history Zheng He's fleet flipped upside down 600 years ago. The Century of Humiliation. The Malacca Dilemma. The barricade of the first island chain. All of that heavy, traumatic history is piled right on top of those tiny sandbars. Right now, China is trying to rewrite the map by building islands out of thin air. They are trying to literally alter geography. They are trying to use human engineering to conjure up what nature denied them. Will it work? Sure. You can maintain a military base built on sand. You can pour concrete for radars and airstrips. But you cannot pave over a century of terror with sand. Geopolitical anxiety isn't cured by an artificial island. The real problem isn't floating on the water. It is printed on the map, and a map is something no single country gets to redraw all by itself. In Part 6, we are going to dig into the paradox of natural resources. Why does striking oil often make a country poorer? How did Venezuela go from the richest, most stable democracy in South America to a totally failed state? We'll explore the crazy paradox of when resources become a curse, not a blessing. See you in the next one.